Cops harassed black twins at a bar, then froze when they flashed their FBI badges. The neon lights of Murphy's bar cast long shadows across the rain-slicked street in downtown Atlanta. It was a Friday night in March, and the place was packed with people trying to wash away the week's troubles. Among them sat two young men at the far end of the bar, nursing their drinks and speaking in low voices. Marcus and Damon Williams, identical twins at 28 years old, had just finished a grueling 2-week undercover operation. They were celebrating quietly, dressed in their crisp button-down shirts and dark slacks, looking nothing like the dangerous criminals they had been tracking for months. Marcus adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and checked his phone while Damon laughed at something on the television screen above the bar. They had no idea that in the next 30 minutes, their quiet celebration would turn into something that would make headlines across the country. The brothers had grown up in this very neighborhood, raised by their grandmother after their parents died in a car accident when they were just 7 years old. Grandma Rose had worked 3 jobs to put them through school, always telling them that education was the only thing nobody could take away from them. She would iron their school uniforms every night, making sure they looked presentable even when they lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment where the heat barely worked in winter. Marcus remembered how she would wake up at 4 in the morning to prepare their breakfast and lunch, her weathered hands moving skillfully despite the arthritis that made her fingers ache. Damon often thought about how she never complained, not once, even when the bills piled up and the refrigerator was nearly empty. She just kept pushing them forward, attending every parent-teacher conference, every science fair, every graduation ceremony with tears of pride in her eyes. Both brothers had excelled in school despite the challenges they faced. Marcus loved mathematics and could solve complex equations in his head faster than most people could type them into a calculator. Damon was passionate about criminal justice and spent his free time reading about famous FBI cases and studying law books he borrowed from the public library. Their teachers often remarked how remarkable it was that 2 boys from such difficult circumstances could maintain straight A's while working part-time jobs to help their grandmother with expenses. When they received full scholarships to Howard University, the entire neighborhood celebrated. Old Mr. Johnson from the corner store gave them free sodas for a week, and Mrs. Patterson, who ran the local beauty shop, told everyone who would listen about those Williams boys who were going places. After graduating with honors, they both applied to the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. The training was brutal, pushing them physically and mentally beyond anything they had experienced before. They ran miles in the rain, practiced shooting until their hands went numb, studied federal law until their eyes burned from exhaustion. But they supported each other through every challenge, just as they had done their entire lives. When Marcus struggled with the physical training, Damon would wake up early to run extra miles with him. When Damon had difficulty with the technical aspects of cybercrime investigation, Marcus would stay up late explaining encryption methods and digital forensics. Their instructors were impressed not just by their individual abilities but by how they worked together, complementing each other's strengths and covering for each other's weaknesses. They graduated in the top 5% of their class, making history as the youngest African-American twins to join the Bureau's elite undercover division. Tonight was supposed to be simple. They had successfully infiltrated a drug trafficking ring that had been flooding Atlanta's streets with fentanyl, gathering enough evidence to secure arrests of 15 major players in the organization. Their handler had given them the weekend off before their next assignment. They chose Murphy's bar because it held good memories. Their grandmother used to work there as a cleaner when they were kids, and the owner, Patrick Murphy, had always been kind to their family. The bar had changed over the years, becoming more upscale as the neighborhood gentrified, but Patrick still recognized them when they walked in, giving them a warm nod from behind the bar. They ordered whiskey neat, a drink their grandmother once told them their father liked, and settled in to watch the Hawks game on the big screen. The trouble started when a group of young white men in expensive suits burst through the door, already drunk from wherever they had been before. They were loud, obnoxious, knocking into tables and spilling drinks without apology. One of them, a red-faced man with a gold watch that probably cost more than most people's cars, stumbled into an elderly black woman sitting near the door, causing her to drop her purse. Instead of helping her, he laughed and made a crude comment about her age. Marcus and Damon exchanged glances but remained seated. They had learned long ago to pick their battles carefully. But when the same man grabbed a young waitress inappropriately as she tried to serve drinks to another table, Damon stood up. He walked over calmly and helped the waitress step away from the man, simply saying, "I think the lady would prefer if you kept your hands to yourself." The drunk man's face turned even redder as he squared up to Damon, shouting slurred insults and racial epithets that made everyone in the bar uncomfortable. Before either twin could defuse the situation, someone had called the police. Within minutes, 4 officers burst through the door, their hands already on their weapons. But instead of addressing the drunk men who were clearly causing the disturbance, they immediately focused on Marcus and Damon. Officer Bradley, a thick-necked man with hostile eyes, pointed at the twins and declared they were disturbing the peace. Marcus tried to explain calmly what had actually happened, but Bradley cut him off, saying he fit the description of someone they were looking for. It was a phrase both brothers had heard too many times in their lives, a convenient excuse that never seemed to require any actual description. The drunk men smirked in the background, one of them actually having the audacity to claim the twins had threatened them. The bar fell silent as everyone watched the scene unfold, many pulling out their phones to record what was happening. Officer Bradley's partner, a younger cop named Stevens, seemed nervous but followed Bradley's lead as they cornered the twins against the bar. Bradley's voice grew louder and more aggressive, demanding to see identification and asking what 2 young black men were doing in this kind of establishment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. The twins were the best dressed, most well-behaved patrons in the entire bar. Marcus kept his hands visible and spoke in measured tones, trying to de-escalate the situation. He explained they were just having a drink after work, that they had done nothing wrong, that multiple witnesses could verify they were actually trying to help when the real troublemakers started harassing other customers. But Bradley wasn't interested in the truth. He had already decided who the criminals were the moment he walked through the door. He stepped closer to Damon, close enough that Damon could smell the coffee and cigarettes on his breath, and said something so quietly that only the twins could hear it. A threat wrapped in a badge, the kind of intimidation tactic they had seen too many times before. The tension in the bar was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several patrons had stood up, ready to intervene if things got worse, but Officer Bradley warned everyone to stay back or face arrest for obstruction. An elderly man in the corner was shaking his head sadly, probably remembering a time when such scenes were even more common. A young couple near the door looked like they wanted to leave but were afraid to move and draw attention to themselves. The waitress who Damon had helped earlier was crying, feeling guilty that her problem had escalated to this point. Patrick Murphy stood behind the bar, his face red with anger, but even he knew better than to challenge police officers who seemed determined to make an arrest. The drunk men who had started everything were now sitting at a table, enjoying the show they had created, occasionally making snide comments that the officers pretended not to hear. Officer Stevens pulled out handcuffs, the metal glinting under the bar lights. He moved toward Marcus first, telling him to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Marcus looked at his brother, and something passed between them. A lifetime of shared experiences, of knowing when to submit and when to stand their ground, of understanding that sometimes the badge on the other side of the law didn't mean justice. This was one of those moments when they had to make a choice. They could allow themselves to be arrested, spend the night in jail, hire lawyers, and eventually clear their names after months of legal battles. Or they could reveal who they really were and flip the script on these officers who thought they had found easy targets. Damon nodded almost imperceptibly, and Marcus knew what they had to do. Moving slowly and deliberately, keeping his hands visible at all times, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. Officer Bradley immediately stepped back, his hand moving to his weapon, shouting for Marcus to freeze. The entire bar held its breath. Some people ducked under tables, fearing the worst. But Marcus continued moving with calm precision, his fingers finding the leather wallet in his pocket. He pulled it out slowly, the fluorescent lights catching on the gold badge as he laid it open on the bar counter. The letters FBI gleamed like a beacon in the dim bar light. Without missing a beat, Damon did the same, placing his badge next to his brother's. The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Bradley's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, fear, and finally, a sick realization of what he had just done. Stevens actually took a step backward, the handcuffs falling from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattering on the floor. "Special Agents Marcus and Damon Williams," Marcus said quietly, but his voice carried throughout the entire bar. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Atlanta Field Office. Badge numbers 4782 and 4783. He pulled out his phone and started recording. "Officers Bradley and Stevens, badge numbers clearly visible on your uniforms, you've just attempted to wrongfully arrest 2 federal agents without cause, ignored the actual perpetrators of disturbance who are sitting right there, and made several discriminatory comments that were recorded by at least 15 witnesses and their cell phones. I'm curious. Would you like to explain to your chief why you're harassing FBI agents, or should we call him ourselves?" The bar erupted. People started clapping and cheering, some shouting, "That's what I'm talking about," and "About time." The elderly black woman near the door stood up and pointed at the officers, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "These boys were protecting us from those drunk fools over there, and you came in here ready to arrest them just because of how they look. Shame on you." Others joined in, emboldened by the revelation, sharing their own stories of similar encounters. The waitress stepped forward and confirmed that Damon had only intervened when she was being harassed. Patrick Murphy came from behind the bar, standing next to the twins, and demanded the officers apologize or leave his establishment immediately. Officer Bradley's face had gone from red to pale white, sweat beading on his forehead despite the bar's air conditioning. He tried to stammer out an explanation, something about following procedure and responding to a call, but his words rang hollow. Everyone in the bar knew exactly what had happened and why. Stevens looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, his young face flushed with embarrassment and shame. The drunk men who had started the whole incident tried to slip out quietly, but several patrons blocked their path, insisting they stay until this was resolved. One of them, suddenly sobering up when he realized he had been harassing federal agents, started apologizing profusely, claiming he didn't know who they were. Damon turned to him coldly and said, "You shouldn't need to know we're FBI agents to treat people with respect." Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call. Within minutes, the bar was filled with more law enforcement, but this time they weren't there to arrest the twins. The FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility arrived along with supervisors from the Atlanta Police Department. The original officers were placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Statements were taken from witnesses, and the drunk men were arrested for assault and public intoxication. The entire incident was documented, and Marcus made sure to get copies of all the cell phone videos that had been recorded. He knew from experience that evidence had a way of disappearing when police misconduct was involved, but not this time. Not with this many witnesses, and not when federal agents were the victims. As the chaos died down and the bar slowly returned to normal, the twins found themselves surrounded by people wanting to thank them, to shake their hands, to share their own stories. An older black man, wearing a veteran's cap, told them about his son who had been wrongfully arrested 3 times despite having committed no crimes, each time fitting the description. A young college student showed them a scar on his forehead from when he had been thrown to the ground by police for walking through his own neighborhood. A middle-aged white woman apologized on behalf of people who stood by and did nothing when they witnessed such injustices. The twins listened to every story, knowing that their badges had given them a power that most people in their community would never have, the power to make those who abuse their authority think twice. Patrick Murphy refused to let them pay for their drinks, insisting it was the least he could do. He told them how proud their grandmother would have been to see them standing up not just for themselves, but for everyone who couldn't. The mention of Grandma Rose brought tears to Marcus's eyes. She had passed away 2 years ago, just 6 months after watching them graduate from the FBI Academy. Her last words to them had been, "Use your badges to protect those who can't protect themselves. Don't forget where you came from." Tonight, they had honored her memory in a way that would have made her smile, that beautiful smile that could light up even their darkest days. As the night wore on, The twins reflected on how this incident was just one small example of what happened every day across the country. They had the protection of federal badges, the backing of the United States government, and still they had been profiled and nearly arrested for simply existing in a space where someone thought they didn't belong. What about all the people who didn't have badges? What about the teenagers walking home from school, the fathers coming back from work, the mothers shopping for groceries, who faced the same harassment without any recourse? The weight of this responsibility sat heavy on their shoulders, but it also strengthened their resolve to continue their work both within the FBI and in their community. The story of what happened that night spread quickly through social media and local news outlets. Cops harassed black twins at a bar, then froze when they flashed their FBI badges, became a viral sensation, shared millions of times with comments ranging from outrage at the officer's behavior to praise for the twins' composure. Interview requests poured in from national news networks, but the twins declined most of them. They didn't want to become celebrities. They wanted to create change. Instead, they worked with the FBI and local police departments to develop better training programs on implicit bias and community policing. They started a mentorship program for young people from their old neighborhood who were interested in law enforcement careers, showing them that they could be part of the solution. Officer. Bradley was eventually fired after the investigation revealed a pattern of discriminatory behavior in his record that had previously been overlooked or excused. Stevens, who was younger and seemed genuinely remorseful, was required to undergo extensive retraining and community service. He actually reached out to the twins months later, apologizing sincerely and asking for their guidance on how to be a better officer. It was a small step, but the twins believed in redemption and second chances. They met with Stevens several times, sharing their experiences and perspectives, hoping that he would carry these lessons throughout his career and influence other officers to do better. The bar incident also led to a broader investigation into discriminatory practices within the Atlanta Police Department. The FBI's Civil Rights Division, with Marcus and Damon serving as key witnesses, uncovered numerous instances of racial profiling and excessive force that had been covered up or ignored. Several officers were prosecuted, and new policies were implemented to increase accountability and transparency. The twins knew it wasn't enough. Systemic change would take generations. But it was a start. Every officer who thought twice before making assumptions, every citizen who felt empowered to speak up against injustice, every child who saw that people who looked like them could be FBI agents, it all mattered. A year after the incident, the twins returned to Murphy's bar for the anniversary. Patrick had framed a photo from that night, a picture someone had taken of the moment they revealed their badges, with Officers Bradley and Stevens frozen in shock in the background. He hung it on the wall with a plaque that read, "Justice served here." The bar had become something of a landmark in the community, a place where people felt safe and protected, where everyone was treated with respect regardless of their appearance or background. That night, the bar was packed with people who had come to celebrate not just the twins, but what they represented: the possibility of change, the power of standing up to injustice, and the hope that one day no one would need badges to be treated with dignity and respect. Marcus stood up to make a toast, his voice carrying across the crowded bar. "A year ago, my brother and I were almost arrested for being black in a bar. We were lucky. We had badges that protected us. But this isn't about us. It's about every person who's been profiled, harassed, or worse, and didn't have a badge to flash. It's about creating a world where the color of your skin doesn't determine how you're treated by those sworn to protect and serve." Grandma Rose used to say, "When you climb up the ladder, you better drop it back down for the next person." That's what we're trying to do. So here's to everyone fighting for justice, with or without a badge. Here's to the day when stories like ours are just history, not headlines. The bar erupted in applause and cheers. Damon added his own thoughts, speaking about how their experience had reinforced their commitment to justice both within and outside the FBI. He announced that they were launching a legal fund to help victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford proper representation. Several wealthy patrons in the bar immediately pledged donations, and within minutes, they had raised enough to help dozens of families seek justice. It was moments like these that reminded the twins why they had become FBI agents in the first place. Not for the power or prestige, but for the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. As the night drew to a close, the twins stood outside Murphy's bar, looking at the street where they had grown up. The old buildings were being renovated, new businesses were opening, and the neighborhood was changing. But some things remained the same: the need for justice, equality, and respect for all people regardless of their race, economic status, or background. They thought about all the young kids in the neighborhood who would grow up hearing about what happened that night at Murphy's bar, about the twins who had stood their ground and turned the tables on injustice. Maybe some of those kids would be inspired to become agents of change themselves, whether in law enforcement, law, politics, or any other field where they could make a difference. The incident at Murphy's bar became a case study at the FBI Academy, required viewing for all new recruits. Marcus and Damon were invited to speak to each new class, sharing not just what happened that night but the broader context of their experiences as Black men in America and as federal agents. They talked about the dual consciousness they carried, being both the protectors and the profiled, the badge carriers and the suspects, the insiders and the outsiders. They challenged new agents to examine their own biases, to remember that behind every suspect was a human being, deserving of dignity and fair treatment, and to never forget that the badge was a responsibility, not a license to discriminate. Years later, when people asked the twins about that night at Murphy's bar, they would say it was both the worst and best night of their professional lives. Worst, because it reminded them of how far society still had to go in addressing systemic racism and police misconduct. Best, because it gave them a platform to create change, to inspire others, and to honor their grandmother's memory in a meaningful way. The title that had gone viral, "Cops Harassed Black Twins at a Bar," then froze when they flashed their FBI badges, became more than just a headline. It became a rallying cry for justice, a reminder that power could be challenged, and proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the tables could be turned on injustice. The twins continued their work at the FBI, rising through the ranks while never forgetting their roots. They solved major cases, took down dangerous criminals, and saved countless lives. But they always said their greatest achievement was that night at Murphy's bar, not because they had embarrassed those officers or gone viral on social media, but because they had stood up for what was right when it would have been easier to stay silent. They had used their privilege as federal agents to shine a light on injustice that too many people experienced every day. And in doing so, they had honored not just their badges but the memory of every person who had faced discrimination and didn't have the power to fight back. As this story comes to a close, remember that somewhere tonight, in bars and restaurants, on street corners and in shopping malls, similar scenes are playing out. Not everyone has FBI badges to flash when confronted with prejudice and abuse of power. But everyone has a voice, a camera phone, and the ability to stand witness to injustice. The story of Marcus and Damon Williams reminds us that change doesn't always come from the top down. Sometimes it comes from two brothers at a bar who refused to be victims, who turned a moment of discrimination into a movement for justice. Cops harassed Black twins at a bar, then froze when they flashed their FBI badges, a title that captured a moment but inspired a movement, proving that sometimes the best revenge against injustice is simply revealing the truth and letting the world see what happens when prejudice meets its match.